Victor was glad thunder had woken him up from his sleep rather than his nightmares. Storms come and go, but those nightmares, they never leave. The werewolf was seeking shelter in a wooden cabin beneath the forest ground. A cabin that didn't belong to him, rather to a man named Theseus. That name never meant much to Victor until a few nights ago. Theseus was the land's most skilled and knowledgeable hunter. He had been dealing with monsters since a teenager. However, as time passed, the concept of hunting monsters became an adrenaline kick for the man instead of the principle behind it. Folks said he drove himself to madness. That line between monster and human became a blurry one. Theseus couldn't tell the difference anymore. His suspicions of human folk became so dire that he slaughtered and carved innocent people, accusing them of being monsters. Victor caught him in the act of murder just a few nights ago. Unfortunately, the victim didn't survive, but Victor made sure Theseus would never harm another human ever again. You see, Victor was a special class werewolf. Special class meant the strongest and fastest category of werewolves that ever existed. His grey fur, blue eyes, and towering humanoid presence was proof of it. To Victor, he only knew one other special class werewolf, a cursed man that needed no introduction, Ragnar Leifsson. However, as powerful as special class werewolves may be, the curse has a downside. They can never revert to their human selves ever again. Victor stared at the full moon many a times, hoping his curse would disappear when the morning sky took over. Alas, he was mistaken. Such was the burden of special class werewolves. They retained their memories, speech, and mannerisms, yet they could never walk freely on the human land ever again. Victor, however, was a bit more special. The written word had been made into a prophecy about him before he was even born. He had just completed the werewolf trials a few weeks ago, and now wishes to return to the land that he once knew. Places like Redwater or the village of Harrow had been names he'd almost forgotten, for the werewolf was a long way from home. The hunter's cabin was small yet cozy, with minimal things inside to get by. Victor spent most of his time studying a stone tablet, an artifact that placed him in this unknown land. Perhaps understanding the markings would help him return home. However, his last candle had almost been depleted, and the cloak that he wore to disguise himself had been torn. Coin was needed. Victor then walked up the stairs leading him to a trapdoor. He opened the latch, climbed out into the forest, and felt the heavy rain soaking his fur. The werewolf adjusted his tattered hooded cloak, black in color, as he traveled the woodland ground, making his way towards a village. When he reached the back entrance of the village, he chose to remain in the shadows behind the tall trees. Victor then tugged on a rope and a bell rang once. Within a few minutes, an energetic village man came hustling through. His body language indicated a man who was about to partake in a shady deal. Then the villager spoke. "It's been a while since we've spoken, friend." Victor, looking at the ground to avoid the man from seeing his blue eyes, had said, "For the last time, I am not your friend." A rather cruel and harsh response, but Victor wasn't the man or the werewolf that he used to be. However, the village man was unbothered by Victor's coldness.
"Say, Bud, village folk are becoming curious. They want to know about the man responsible for getting rid of monsters from the land. You can trust me. You don't need to hide in the shadows anymore,"
Victor replied. "Do you have any work for me?"
"Oh, yes indeed."
The villager flipped through a few pages of parchment and handed 3 sheets to Victor. The werewolf lifted his hand to grab it but then paused. He leaned to his right, shook his arm, and let the bagginess of the cloak cover his furry hand. Then he reached forward and grabbed the pages. "Who are these people?" he said. On those parchment sheets were sketches of 3 people done by village folk, 2 women and 1 man, Sherry, Mary Beth, and Cedric respectively. Villagers had then hid behind walls, taking a peek and spying on the conversation. The village man Timothy chased them away, feeling embarrassed. "I'm really sorry about that," he said to Victor. "These sketches are folk from this village. They were abducted a few hours ago from this very forest, though none seemed too eager to retrieve them."
"And why is that?"
"Well, my people saw 2 vampires snatching them away."
"You sure they were vampires?"
asked Victor. Timothy responded like he was offended. "Are you kidding me? Vampires are like werewolves. We can spot them a mile away." From a flash of lightning and a loud thundercrack, Victor's appearance was revealed for a brief moment, though not long enough for Timothy to see the monstrous werewolf in front of him. And so Timothy continued. "They were pale," the villagers said. "Pale creatures, a man and a woman, moving so quickly they appeared as blurs. They grabbed Sherry, Mary Beth, and Cedric and then disappeared behind the fog before the storm arrived." Victor folded the pages neatly and kept them in the cloak pocket.
"I'll look into it."
Then Timothy's energetic demeanor changed to a troubled one. "Forgive me, friend," he said, and I don't mean to doubt you, but do you think you could take on 2 vampires all by your lonesome?" Timothy's concern was valid. Despite being a special class werewolf, vampires were still much quicker than Victor. The werewolf ignored the question and proposed one of his own, with just a single word.
"Payment."
"Ah, yes, of course," Timothy said. "Just the same like the last night. Let's see, candles, ink, and parchment."
"And a cloak,"
Victor added. "A cloak," responded Timothy.
"I need a cloak large and loose enough to fit me. The water hag from last we spoke tore my current one."
Timothy's eyes lit up. "Why, of course I could arrange that. I am a master tailor myself, that I am." He looked at Victor and mumbled the measurements in his head. "Just give me a few minutes and it'll be done," he said. As Victor turned around to walk away, the village man said, "Still no luck in returning to your home, eh? I told you, mister. I, nor anyone from around here, have ever heard or known of places called Redwater or the Harrow before." Victor the werewolf was already a great distance away. He was deep in thought, snuffing the air, trying to catch a scent. Vampires may be undead creatures of the night, but they had a strange metallic blood-like smell to them. Victor's sense of smell was heightened, though he could only catch the scent from the earth from the pouring rain. He would normally take his time, plan his attack, but the werewolf had to be hasty with this hunt. He didn't want to make it known to Timothy and cause more panic to an already distraught village. Those vampires responsible for the abduction could have easily drained the blood of their victims right then and there in the forest. Vampires do not play with their food, and that detail troubled Victor. It wasn't the fact that he was hunting 2 vampires, rather the dilemma of going up against a hive of them. From the strange behavior of abduction done by the vampires told Victor one thing. They were taking their victims to a vampire nest. Though the storm continued, the rain had softened and the wind calmed itself, giving Victor a chance to fully catch the scent of not only the vampires, but the victims as well. The scent had taken him to a small house in the woods. The cottage looked modest, but the strobe light caused by lightning revealed peeling paint and broken gutters. This house had been abandoned for a very long time. Victor stood a great distance away. He knelt to the ground on one knee and touched the wet soil. There were tracks on the ground, a body being dragged with much force and aggression. The werewolf then rubbed his fingers together and brought them to his nose. A fragrance of rose and lavender mixed with a stinging metallic blood-like smell. When the werewolf approached closer, he heard the horrific sounds coming from inside the cottage. Biting, slurping, and a slippery swishing sound thumping against the windows. There was also a sound of a heartbeat fading away into the night. However, a cottage of that size would not be suitable for a vampire nest. Not only was it too small, but it was also too visible. Nevertheless, there were obviously vampires feeding on something or someone inside. Victor walked up to the door and calmly placed his ear against it, then knocked 3 times. His hand was so large and strong that it sounded like a hammer. Victor heard 2 vampires inside. The feeding noises abruptly stopped and they hissed in frustration. The male vampire angrily told the other to check who was at the door. His voice sounded coarse, evident that blood had been coating the insides of his throat. When the female vampire opened the door, she saw no one standing in front, just the breeze blowing through her long brown hair. Victor, however, could see her clearly. He was hiding in a tree in front of the cottage. One thing was certain. The villagers' descriptions were not exaggerations. These vampires were indeed pale. The female vampire had blood smeared on her face, but more plentiful around the mouth. Then she snuffed and caught Victor's scent, but it was too late. Victor leaped off the branch and dove towards the vampire woman. He tackled her to the ground and bit off a chunk of her neck. It all happened so quickly, and the vampire did manage to slice Victor's chest with her razor-sharp fingernails. However, to her surprise, the werewolf's wounds closed up almost instantly. Perks of being a special class werewolf. Victor wasted no time. He darted his hand towards the woman's chest, though not as a punch or a closed fist. His hand created a hole in the vampire's sternum, and then the werewolf ripped out her heart. The vampire man was kneeling on the ground, feeding on the victim. When he picked his head up, same like the vampire woman, his face smeared with blood. His fangs pushed out his mouth, and despite his long blood-soaked hair, his bat-like ears could not be concealed. He ran towards Victor, moving as a blur, just as the villagers had said. Then the vampire reached both his hands in front, fingernails growing like a switch had been flipped, ready to rip the werewolf apart. But those were not higher vampires. Yes, they were fast, but definitely not as quick as Fullian Hunt. The vampire thought his shadow had been playing tricks on him, when in reality it was Victor, moving with such speed and menacing fluidity. The werewolf crept up behind the vampire and snapped his neck before he turned. This wouldn't end him, but that was the plan. Victor needed one of them alive, so to speak. The werewolf had a moment to scan the room. The victim on the floor matched the third sketch Timothy had given him. The vampires were feeding on Cedric. He had lost too much of blood and clearly on his last breath. However, there was no blood near or around the victim's mouth, indicating there was no blood exchange or vampire turning. Victor put his head down. He wanted to save all 3 of them. Then he looked around the room and saw 2 more bodies piled in the corner. However, they were not part of the other 2 victims. Their bodies were decayed and possibly the owners of the cottage. Victor's eyes then moved to the wooden chair fallen over by the wooden table. It gave the werewolf an idea. The vampire man would wake up shortly, which meant whatever was brewing inside the werewolf's mind had to be put into action immediately. 7 minutes and 47 seconds later, the vampire regained consciousness, but he wasn't standing. He was lying on the wooden table with the room light switched on directly over him. The brightness of the bulb stung his eyes, and when he tried to sit up or move, he couldn't. A wooden stake had been stuck in his arms respectively, right between the forearm and bicep, pinning him to the table. Victor had dismantled the wooden chair. Then the vampire hissed and growled at the werewolf. Without the cloak, Victor's true appearance was clear as day. He was well over 6 feet, his grey fur barely able to hide the muscle beneath. His blue eyes looked unnatural, sinister and glowing with ominous intention. Victor stood beside the table, arms folded, observing the vampire carefully. "I used to be a surgeon, you know, before this curse took over me at least." Suddenly, when the vampire's senses returned fully, he started screaming frantically in pain. Victor placed his furry hand over the vampire's mouth and said, "Shh. Do not disturb the forest. The animals are sleeping." The werewolf, still with folded arms, paced around the table. "You vampires have an immensely high pain tolerance, and you can heal, though you are not immune to suffering." Victor in this instance would be correct. The vampire on the wooden table had indeed recovered from the broken neck. However, that was only due to the blood it previously consumed. But now, being depleted from fresh blood, would the vampire be able to heal just as quickly as damage was being dealt to him? "Where are the other 2 victims?" The vampire hissed at the werewolf and spat at him. "Wrong answer," Victor said, taking the sharpened wooden leg-turned stake and piercing the vampire's leg, further pinning him to the table. With the force Victor used, one would think his hand was a sledgehammer. The stake penetrated between the shin and upper foot. The vampire screamed with agonizing pain, trying to wriggle himself free. "I have carefully put the stake in. Your veins have been severed, ligaments have been ruptured, and your tendons are torn beyond repair. Where are the other 2 victims?" The vampire cursed at Victor but had been interrupted by another stake through the other leg at the exact same spot. "Next one goes through your heart," Victor said. In agonizing pain, the vampire barely yelled out the information needed. The other 2 victims, Sherry and Mary Beth, were delivered to the nest. The nest was located at an old abandoned railway station, 16 minutes north of the cottage. These 2 vampires were basically peasants to the nest. The higher vampires used them for their dirty work, such as abducting victims from nearby villages. As their reward, the higher vampires allowed them to keep one victim to themselves to feed on. Victor asked, "Are the victims still alive?" "Yes," the vampire blurted out in pain. He told Victor that if he removed the stakes, then he would gladly escort the werewolf to the nest. Victor, however, did not need to verbally refuse. The last stake through the vampire's heart was a clear response. Victor donned his black cloak, which had now barely been holding itself together. He glanced at Cedric with a painful look in his blue eyes. The werewolf would have to return to the cottage to fetch the body. It wasn't even a matter of payment or getting the job done, rather a form of respect for the family to perform the man's last rite. Then the werewolf exited the cottage and headed north. He didn't just move like a werewolf, more like a shadow navigating the forest at night. He had to be quick. It had been confirmed higher vampires occupied the nest, which meant the victims would not be alive much longer. That is, if the feeding hadn't already begun. Victor reached the abandoned railway station. He understood why the vampires chose that place as a nest. It wasn't difficult to find, but the darkness alone would deter anyone from exploring further. The werewolf took a deep breath in and exhaled slowly. Not only did he want to keep his heavy breathing to a lower volume, he also wanted to quieten his heartbeat. The eerie silence coming from the bottom of the stairway was alarming. The fur running down Victor's spine had risen like spikes. The vampires below fed more silently than those in the cottage. With the intensity of the thunderstorm being at its all-time high, Victor walked down the stairway with only his blue eyes illuminating the darkness. The concrete steps had no railings on either side, just the walls. With every step closer, the horrific sounds became louder. Slurping, gulping, and drinking that sounded more like chewing or suction through a straw. The werewolf got a hint of the rose and lavender scent from earlier, though faintly. The metallic blood-like smell was too overbearing. When Victor reached the bottom, he peeked around the wall, glancing to his left. An ordinary human would just see tiny white eyes moving in the darkness, pupils that looked more like dots than natural eyes. The werewolf, however, could see clearly in the dark. The floor was covered in blood. The walls had blotches of blood smeared and spilled that looked ugly and messy. However, vampires did not find such a scene messy or disgusting. To them, it was their art gallery. Victor's claws involuntarily unsheathed themselves with how disgusting and obscene the place looked. The vampires were slouched over the ground, feeding on victims. Victor knew of a higher vampire back at home, though he looked nothing like what Victor was seeing. Their human selves were completely lost. So much so, Victor wondered if they were even once human at some point. Their ears were much larger and pointy than the vampires in the cottage. All 5 of them were bald, with skin that looked more like plastic wrapped around their bones. Victor could still see their spines. These vampires were starving. When they took breaks from feeding, they would stretch their necks backwards. That's when Victor saw the purplish pulsating veins crawling on their faces, like tributaries on a map. He'd never seen anything like it in his past 8 months of being a werewolf. Those vampires do not look like they belonged to the land. Rather, they were resurrected. To Victor's right were Sherry and Mary Beth, identical to the sketches. Both of them sat against the wall with their eyes closed, right arm to their sides respectively. There was a bandage wrapped around their forearms with 2 spots of blood seeping through, puncture marks caused by the fangs. This told Victor the ancient vampires had indeed tasted their blood, but kept them aside to feed on later. The werewolf knew that trying to sneak them out of there would not only put him at a disadvantage from carrying them, but also put their lives in danger if and when the vampires attack. Victor removed his torn cloak and folded it neatly, keeping it on the last step. He loosened his neck, cracked his knuckles, and took another deep breath in. That had alerted the vampire creatures. They hissed and growled, crawling to their feet. Their white eyes now larger than before. Victor's eyes, however, were no longer a soft blue. They turned red like a contact lens had replaced his natural color. The wind whistled through the ground floor of the railway station. Only the sound of hisses and snorts, followed by a deep, low, ominous growl from Victor. And then the fight commenced. 3 vampires charged at Victor first. The werewolf front-kicked the middle one, sending the creature flying against the wall. The other 2 had already been beside Victor. They clawed at him with fingernails long and sharp, like thin daggers. He growled and moaned in pain, but he knew that a lot more damage was soon to follow. With his left hand, he twisted it around and took a swipe at the vampire adjacent to him. As for the one on the right, he grabbed the vampire not by the throat, by the top of its head, and pulled it off like it was a toy. The other 2 vampires had then pounced on Victor's back, maneuvering around the werewolf's body like spiders. Victor tried reaching for them, swinging his large arm backwards, missing with every try. The werewolf's neck and shoulders were being bitten and clawed. He felt those fangs puncturing his body, and the only thing that he could do for now was grunt and groan. Then Sherry and Mary Beth regained consciousness. They were startled, kicking their legs forward to further back themselves against the wall. They couldn't see Victor. In fact, they couldn't see anything. Just a pair of red eyes and 5 pairs of white eyes, frantically moving in the darkness. Victor heard their petrified heartbeats and yelled at them to get out of there. His deep voice frightened them at first, but they had no choice but to listen to the stranger. Sherry and Mary Beth stumbled their way up the staircase. Behind them, they heard the echoing sounds of flesh being torn apart. Growls, hisses and roars, and a few bones being snapped and broken here and there. For 6 minutes they hid behind the tree at the top until they heard silence. Shortly after, a deep voice groans as it gets louder. Victor, in pain, slowly and uncomfortably put on his cloak. The village woman saw his red eyes change to blue and they were staggered. He stumbled towards them, dripping blood like a leaking geyser.
Sherry and Mary Beth, Timothy sent me.
Those were the only words he could mutter before showing them the sketches and missing posters of themselves. With rapid succession of lightning flashes, the woman's eyes traveled towards the stairway. Though only for a split second with each flash, they saw vampire creatures at the bottom of the stairway, dismembered in the most horrific way possible. Their eyes widened with fear, daring not to glance at the monstrous cloaked being in front of them. Victor said,
You know your way back to the village.
Sherry and Mary Beth looked at each other, then gave a nod to Victor. The werewolf nudged his head to the side, gesturing for them to leave. Once they left, still feeling weak and drained, Victor took a few agonizing breaths, closed his eyes gradually, then slowly fell backwards, slamming his werewolf body to the ground. 1 hour and 15 minutes later, Victor was at the end of the woods standing behind a tree near the back entrance of the village. With Cedric's body over his left shoulder, Victor tugged on the rope and rang the village bell once. His eyes remained blue, his grey fur soaked with blood, and while his wounds had fully closed, he still felt the lingering pain of the damage done to him by the vampires. This time, Timothy wasn't as energetic as he was before. It would be sunrise soon, but that wasn't the reason for a demeanor change. With the baggy cloak covering Victor's hands, he gently placed Cedric's body in the arms of Timothy.
Forgive me. I couldn't save him.
Timothy excused himself to deliver the body of Cedric to the now would-be grieving family. He returned with a large brown sack shortly after.
You have nothing to apologize for, friend, said Timothy.
Victor saw how saddened the village man was, but his attitude was admirable. He knew it was bad, tragic, and heartbreaking even, but to him it could have been worse. There was always a positive thought to fall back to. For Timothy, there was always the light at the end of the tunnel. Thanks to you, 2 of the best village nurses are returned home safely. And the fact that you would bring Cedric's body back reveals more about your character than you think. Victor didn't say anything for a while. Thank you for that, I appreciate it, it means a lot, were sentences that couldn't seem to come out. Timothy filled the silence by saying, I have your stuff in the bag. I know with absolute certainty the cloak will fit, but you're welcome to bring it back for alterations. Victor picked up the sack, tossed it over his shoulder, and said thanks. The rain was gradually lessening in its intensity, and the thunder, while still present, wasn't as loud as before. As Victor turned around to walk away, Timothy said, So, you're a werewolf then? Victor stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes widened, but he dared not look back at Timothy. Another long pause. Sherry and Mary Beth told me. They've seen werewolves before, but none like you, they said. They told me what you did to those vampires. Victor put his head down, his blue eyes looking at his furry feet. He felt ashamed, embarrassed by what he had become. Timothy continued. They told me how you saved them from those monsters. If it wasn't for you, they wouldn't be alive. Just as Victor was about to walk away, the village man in his medieval tunic-like attire had said, If you think that makes me or the village folk think of you differently, then you would be mistaken. I do not know what happened to you or where you came from, but folk around here are different. We do not judge based on appearance. We judge by actions. You have prevented drownings by getting rid of the water hag a few nights ago, and now you got rid of the vampires. If anything, we owe you our lives. Victor took a moment to comprehend those words. How long has it been since he heard something like that?
If your current lodgings do not serve you well, you always have a home in this village. And that's not just coming from me, but the villagers as well.
Victor, still looking at his feet, said,
Thank you, friend.
Timothy said, When you are ready to reveal yourself to me, I trust that you will. But until then, may I at least know your name, friend? The werewolf looked over his shoulder and then just a little bit more.
Victor. My name's Victor.
Then the werewolf walked away into the remaining hours of the night, making his way to the hunter's cabin, ready to spend even more restless nights deciphering the stone tablet. Sherry and Mary Beth, now with tended wounds and fresh and clean bandages, stood by either side of Timothy. They spoke in a soft voice simultaneously and asked, So who is he then? Timothy, with a warm, comforting smile on his face, had answered, That's Victor. Victor the werewolf.